I'm excited that we have Dr. Jill Zaretsky here with us to talk a little about her NSF-funded project. You know, if you haven't been to these before, it's an informal research talk where we get to kind of ask questions of Dr. Zaretsky at the end, and just kind of engage in the things that she's working on, learn from her, and learn about her work. And so I'm going to let Dr. Zaretsky introduce kind of the work, but please put your hands together to welcome her here.
Hey, thanks everybody for braving the snow. I'm really pleased to see so many people here. Thank you for coming and sharing your time with me. Jill Zaretsky, thank you, Dr. Birmingham, for the introduction. I'm an assistant professor in the Adult Education and Training program, so my work largely focuses on adult learning and education, but my background is in mathematics and STEM education. So some parts of this project, which I'll talk about as we go through it, are really living at the intersection of those two things. So adults learning STEM content, for example. This project is funded by the National Science Foundation, which that money only started in August. So what you're getting here is a lot of the upfront sort of process and thinking behind the project. Not so much to show yet in terms of results, but I'd be happy to talk about where we think that's headed as we go along. So I'm the PI on the CSU portion of this project, in partnership with my colleagues Rhonda Sturminger and Michelle Line at Texas A&M, and 3 graduate students. Rachel Short is also at Texas A&M. Jeff Rodriguez is here at CSU. He's a master's student in Human Dimensions of Natural Resources. And Lauren Villan is a master's student in the Adult Education and Training program here. So she's online at a distance, and maybe we'll get to see the video. So I wanted to just talk about a little bit of background on field stations as a context for informal STEM learning, a little bit about our project, even though it's just launched. If you're interested in learning more, we've got some things up on our project website. Some results from the pilot study that informed the grant proposal, and the conceptual framework that we're working from as part of designing the survey and analyzing the data for this project. So I want to start by just telling you a little bit about field stations, because I think that's not a place or a context that we think about particularly often. There are over 400 field stations in the United States, as represented by dots and triangles. So all of these are the US field stations. Typically they're affiliated with universities or national parks, sometimes private foundations. And so we've got a lot of nice variety in terms of location here. Field stations provide 4 main functions. Access to the environment. Typically they're located in places of interest for some reason, ecological, environmental, scientific interest. And provide logistical support for all kinds of activities. We typically associate that with scientific research, which is why so many of them are affiliated with universities. But they're also great places for training students, and the piece that we're really interested in, outreach, right? Connecting the public and local communities to whatever the interest is at that particular site. As part of being sites of scientific interest of some kind, there are also opportunities to establish model ecosystems. So they're typically protected, and with so much scientific interest and engagement, there's some things you can do there that you might not be able to do in any kind of place. And last, fostering a community of scholars. So bringing together research scientists and students and the public in some way really creates an opportunity for community around a scientific endeavor that doesn't exist in a lot of other places.
So the funding comes from a variety of sources?
Yeah, so NSF funds a lot of field stations, which is one of the things that affects their outreach programs. So a lot of university funds go there. For example, the CSU Mountain Campus is considered a field station, as is the Todos Santos station in Mexico. And those tend to be sites more of university education than of research right now. But the university funds those. A lot of private donations, especially for the private foundations. People who are interested in the science and the environment donate to these kind of sites. And then, yeah, lots of federal funding from NSF, most of which funds the scientific endeavors and the university undergrad and graduate training. But if you're familiar with the requirements for NSF proposals, one of those elements is a broader impacts program. And so I think that's actually a launch point for a lot of the activity that's already happening at field stations that NSF says, as part of doing this scientific research project, you also need to make a case for how that project benefits society, the community, other people, right? You're doing good work scientifically. What good is it for humanity in some sense, right? So a lot of the outreach at biological field stations is grounded in NSF requirements that work needs to be disseminated not just through scholarly outlets, but in broader ways. So we've got a ton of field stations with some key functions. And building from this idea of community and engaging other people through outreach, approximately 78% of the US population lives within 60 miles of a field station, and 98% within 120 miles. So if you think not just about the scientific endeavors, the inherent ecological, environmental interest at these places, but also their accessibility, like there's tremendous opportunity here to connect people to the environment, to science at these sites. And what you can do there is really have a personal experience with nature guided by people who know their scientific stuff, right? So you can go to a national park and have a great experience, and maybe you get to talk to a ranger or a docent, and maybe you don't, right? But at field stations, because they're based in the scientific endeavor, there's an opportunity there to communicate science and have an experience with nature that's really unique to these kinds of places. So great sites for education on issues of conservation and sustainability, back to that issue of them being cultivating model ecosystems, for example. So the project that NSF has funded is a national survey of these 400 plus field stations. As of right now, or yesterday, we have had 90 field stations respond to our survey to tell us about 236 distinct activities or programs. And that's really what we want to get at, is we know that the outreach is happening. We know that these field stations are engaging their communities and schools and the public in general, but how and what and how's it going, right? We know it's happening. We know there's tremendous capacity there, but like the tangibles are all missing, and that's really what we're trying to get at here. So we spent most of the fall semester developing the survey. It launched just before the holidays, and we've already got, you know, almost a 25% response rate, which if you do surveys, you know that's nuts in a good way. That also means we've got piles and piles of data, which is a good problem to have, but which means that I don't have a lot to tell you right now, because that's definitely the team's project right now as we work with data benchmarks. Okay, of these first 150 programs, how are we going to process this data? What are the pieces that we're going to look at? What analyses are we going to run? And that's our ongoing team conversation. That is not currently part of our funding, so we're thinking of this as a scoping study of sorts, right? We want to capture a snapshot of what's currently happening at field stations, and we want to leverage that to be able to say some things about what they're doing well and who they're engaging, and then downstream build some great resources for them, right? I think Ann asked a great question before we started. How are you getting this kind of response rate? And I think the key is that we've tapped into something that field stations know they need, but don't have the time or expertise to do for themselves, right? So they know they need more resources and scholarship on their outreach programs to do a better job, to leverage their resources more effectively, but they're also conducting their science, right? Most people at field stations are not trained educators. Most people at field stations are not in positions where their primary work responsibility is conducting the outreach. That's a sideline. So if we can come in with our educational expertise and our field station expertise and our methodological expertise and collect a bunch of data about what they're already doing it, process it, and give it back to them as something that they can actually use to improve their programs or streamline their efforts, that's the win. So here we're really just trying to capture what's going on now, what are the needs, what's going well, where are the opportunities, and then we think of the next one as maybe the next project will be site visits and diving deep in a few places as exemplars of really great programs or programs that have a lot of opportunity. So in a preliminary sense, I think where we're headed is really focusing on strategies for field stations to better engage their participants and helping with their evaluation and assessment. That's a thing that's always a project, right? Is evaluation and assessment. So I want to talk a little bit next about what we mean by outreach, what that looks like at field stations with some specific examples, and the conceptual model that we use to design our survey and what we hope to connect our results back to be able to say some concrete things. Questions so far?
Are you going to tag interviews at all on the survey?
We've been doing a little bit of follow-up to clarify sort of muddy responses. Definitely one of the tricky things in the survey design is trying to get at our educational constructs without using educational jargon. And so that's where we miss a little bit sometimes, is we phrased it this way and we think it connects to this construct, but participants who don't have an educational background read it differently than we intended, right? So in classic survey challenges. So interviews are happening a little bit as part of the follow-up. We've got a group of collaborating field stations who've agreed to serve as, they did some survey preview reviews. We're using them a little bit for member checking. This is what you said in your survey. Is this what you really meant? Those kind of things. But again, I think interviews are likely to be the next step. The other tricky part here is that it's not necessarily one person doing all of these things, right? So typically surveys are filled out by the station director or the head of their outreach programs. But in a station that's really big and has 30 programs, like we can't interview 30 people from one station. We need a snapshot of what they're willing to submit in the survey, and then we need to keep moving, right? So there's some pragmatic strategies that we're having to work through too. And we know we're missing a lot of data, and we're also getting, plenty. So there's the tension point in that. The survey takes, I think 15 minutes for the background information, and then another 15 minutes for each additional program that they tell us about, right? So people burn out pretty fast on that because we're asking for a huge level of detail on each and every program. Jeff, did I get those numbers right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Are they like open responses, or are they Likert scales? Or
There's some Likert scales, there's some multi-selects, those kind of things.
Okay.
And we've got questions on the size of the field station and their funding. We're interested in who their target audience is, if they're reaching their target audience, how much money they're spending, how many people they're getting through in a year, and then we break it down into who's running the programs and what are those credentials, how are the programs assessed. Parts that are going to be in our conceptual model are things like methods for engaging participants, STEM content areas, learning outcomes, alignment of programs with field station overarching goals, right? Large amounts of stuff. So our operational definition of outreach is purposefully broad. Any effort by field stations to promote public awareness of STEM knowledge through informal education. So basically anything that they're trying to do to push their information out or to bring people in and share it with them when they get there counts as outreach. So the specific examples I'm going to share are from our pilot study, where we had 73 activities shared by 20 field stations. one of our key partners in this project is the Organization of Biological Field Stations, and so we recruited through their email listserv. So the topics of these outreach programs, 62% general science, 26% environment, conservation, or ecology, and 40% explicitly reflected aspects of the field station's location. So at this site, we have this particular animal, plant, creature, right? At this site, we have this particular intersection of particularly interesting environmental qualities. And so 40% of the activities that they shared with us were leveraging those unique place-based qualities for their outreach programming. So even though general science is great, environment, conservation, ecology, all great, these stations exist because of the unique qualities of place. And 40% of them in this pilot study were leveraging those unique qualities of place. Yeah, Danny?
I'm kind of shocked it's only 40%.
Well, and this is where I think we have some limitations in our survey, because I actually think it's 100%.
Yeah.
And that they're just not getting to a place where they like they're doing it without it being a conscious effort. And a lot of this too is that people are coming to the field station. So even if it's not an explicit element of the program, it is an explicit part of the experience for participants, right?
Yeah.
You have gone there, you are learning about this place. Even if you're doing sort of a general water quality activity, you're still interacting with the waters in this particular spot. And so I think there's place-based inherently by being there. I think there's place-based whether they're acknowledging or thinking about it or not. And I think this is probably a low estimate.
So, I mean, it might reveal things about your survey, but it also might reveal things about the respondents and the ways in which they think about education and learning, and how they feel, or how they see it connected to this local environment.
And that's a great point. And this was from our pilot study, and we did a lot of things wrong. Which is
That's why you do a pilot.
That's why you do a pilot study. We did a lot of things wrong, but we got enough to get pointed in the right direction for this big one. We think, we hope. So the other parts of this, huge variation in structure and approach. So some things as simple and straightforward as a lecture series, maybe on natural history, maybe one of the resident scientists talks about their research, as informal as guided nature walks, as rigorous and complex as a citizen science project, or volunteer training for restoration or natural protection projects. Classes on nature-based hobbies, for example, bird watching or foraging for edible plants, and some things that were as structured and formal as science education for schools, right? For example, one field station buses out students from the local urban area, and they do activities at the field station aligned with state standards and national science curriculums, right? So we've got the whole spectrum of, well, I unlock the gates, to this is high quality educational programming with all the structure, alignment, and assessment you could ever wish for. So I mean, one field station director actually said, well, I unlock the gates. Does that count as outreach? He was trying to get at me, but we had a really good conversation based on that.
Provided you with a priceless quote.
In the moment, I was low-key annoyed with him, but it worked out okay. So we've got this huge variety in structure approach of activities, great variety in target ages. So the most common being programs for all ages, adults, specific for youth, young adults, university students. We've got a little bit of everything going on here. So you can expect that the pieces I will look forward to popping out for myself will be the adult part and maybe the all ages. But there's something for everybody here in terms of who are you interested in working with, and who do you want to see grow in their knowledge of STEM content and scientific skills. So what we really want to focus on moving forward in this project are the place-based elements. because even though only 40% said place-based in that pilot study, like I said, I really think that it's everything. I think that that's at the core of what's going on at field stations. But a lot of moving parts with all of this variety that we're seeing in participants and structure and activity types. And that's where our working conceptual framework comes from. So this is where we are right now. So the overarching idea here, field station outreach goals. At the beginning, I mentioned a little bit about the requirements from NSF to have a broader impacts component of a funded project. And so a lot of field station outreach goals are really connected to what they told NSF they were gonna do, right? So what they told NSF they were gonna do, what their parent institution, a university, a national park, a foundation, thinks that they ought to be doing. So some big picture stuff. How does educational outreach help you achieve your bigger goals? And so when the team has gone to the Organization of Biological Field Station annual conferences, these are the conversations that we're pushing, is the intentionality and the connection among what your field station needs to be doing and what you're actually doing when you're trying to reach out to your community or your schools, and having those things work together, which from an education perspective feels like a little bit of a no-brainer, right? But this is the kind of thing that is blowing people's minds a little bit in these conversations. Oh, my outreach could support this other thing I'm supposed to be doing. So the message we really want to communicate to our target audience of field station personnel is we know that that comes first, right? And everything else should build from what your station needs to accomplish. We've got approaches for learner engagement, sort of what are you doing? The STEM content, what information are you conveying to participants? What information do you want them to take away? Strands of science learning, which I would say is, and I'll talk about these more in a sec, maybe a little bit of a Bloom's taxonomy specific to science. And all of this feeding into what's unique, important, critical about the place in which your field station is located. And so filtering content, engagement, types of science learning through place hopefully gets us to the desired learning outcomes, which then feed back into your overarching goals of what do you want to accomplish for your station and how does outreach connect to that. So approaches to learner engagement, this is our language for a variety of different educational constructs and theories that we're seeing play out at field stations. Many of these I think the education folks in the room will recognize. Community-based learning, contextualized, discovery-based, experiential, inquiry-based service. These are all things that we see happening individually or in pairs or small groups among field stations. So in the survey, this is one of the Likert scale questions. So we tried to ask about community learning without using the jargon of community learning, right? Are you involving the community in this? Do participants generate outcomes that are meaningful to the community? Those kinds of things. So for example, W.K. Kellogg Biological Station in Michigan has an event called a grazing school that brings together farmers and scientists to learn more about managed grazing systems. So they work to improve upon an activity that everyone cares about, such as feeding dairy animals, and to increase their capacity to manage their lands effectively. So it's community-based because different stakeholders have an interest in this going well, because it brings together farmers and scientists to learn together to create an outcome that they all care about. So community in the sense of that collaborative approach and their shared ecological resource, and contextualized because it's grounded in something that they're all already working on, feeding dairy animals. Or for example, Pepperwood Preserve in California has a program, Students Conducting Environmental Inquiry. So we would call this discovery-based and experiential. Participants are asked to, they get a little observation protocol, and then they walk around the preserve and make observations about flora and fauna, and then have to come up with questions based on what they observed, which they then go back out and try to answer, right? So different kinds of approaches embedded in a variety of activities. The strands of science learning are from the National Research Council. So I've bolded sort of the keywords to take away from this, starting with excitement, interest, motivation, right? Just hooking them, right? All the way up to developing an identity as someone who knows or does science, right? So we've got a nice spectrum of, yeah, I could be interested in that, all the way to I am a scientist, and building on increasing levels of complexity and engagement. So for example, Thomas More College Biology Field Station has hands-on learning opportunities for youth under 13, where they come to the station and they do water quality testing and collect macroinvertebrates. And so they're experiencing science by getting to play around in the water and collect stuff. They're actually getting to test, explore, question through this activity, and by actually doing science, right? By collecting the macroinvertebrates and then going to look at them later, and like that's a thing scientists do, right? So we're building on a couple of different strands of science learning through that activity. Citizen science projects, for example, really live in 5, right? You may not be the person designing the research project, but by helping a scientist, you are participating in that science activity and using the language and tools associated with it. Questions so far? Yeah.
Actually, I have one question about previous slide about the definition of
Okay.
approach to learner engagement.
Uh-huh.
I'm just wondering what's exactly the difference between community learning and surface learning. So, I mean, because it looks like they have some community connection. So what's exactly the difference between the community and the surface learning? Because I'm only familiar because I'm from physical therapy background.
Uh-huh.
So when I took the physical therapy education, usually most of our curriculum or design is based on the kind of inquiry-based learning and experiential learning, but we haven't got the kind of community or surface learning, something like that.
Okay, so I'm thinking about this as a collective activity versus,
Yeah.
so here, as part of community learning, the group might identify a need and then work to build a strategy and implement it. Whereas in service learning, I think the needs are already identified and learners or participants are being involved in the solution, but maybe not the needs assessment or the problem identification is the way that I think about that. So these two might pair nicely, right? A community learning event might bring a variety of stakeholders together to identify that dairy animal feeding is a problem in the community, and then you work to devise a solution. Maybe we need to have a grazing school where everybody comes together and we work on these land management. Maybe the last part is sending students out to map the grazing lands and assess their different qualities and bring it back to then inform further work of the community learning. That's not a real example, I kind of just winged that. But those are how I see those pieces potentially fitting together, right? So certainly there's a lot of overlap here, right? Which is why very few programs live in a single approach, right? The thing you'll also notice is that we haven't included a lot of the sort of traditional or de facto approaches, right? So a transmission style strategy for engaging learners, maybe that's the default, but that's not really where we see the key work of field station outreach going, right? So this certainly is not all-encompassing of everything that could be happening. This is more the aspirational approaches that we would like to see folks moving into, right? So the guy who says, I just unlock the gates, I'm not on here, right?
Jill, question.
Yeah.
I still struggle with case-based, problem-based learning with outcomes. The pushback is the assessment of, is it successful, is it not, how do you know?
Yeah.
Are you going to be?
What does success look like?
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So are you going to be looking at that at all?
I think that's a downstream thing because it's so hard, right? That I think we're going to really have to build up to that. And the other part of that is sometimes it matters and sometimes it doesn't, right? We would like ultimately for participant engagement to affect knowledge and skills and attitudes and behaviors, but sometimes it's good enough that somebody showed up, right? I mean, just from a practical perspective. Even here, I would like for you to take something away from this that you can go use in your own work or that you talk to other people about later. But in some sense, it's enough that you're here and you're thinking about it and you're soaking something in. What needs to come from this seminar, right? What needs to come from adults listening to a research talk and having some dessert at the same time, right? And we've got this whole spectrum, and this is where we're back to, I think, fitting this into field station outreach goals, right? Is your goal just to get people to show up and have an experience and know a little bit more, or are you trying to do something more, right? So in the K-12 context, it makes perfect sense that we would need to be able to assess and evaluate, that we would need to be able to demonstrate student learning as part of meeting our curriculum and standardized testing goals, right? But once we get past that point, what do adults need to be able to take away from this? Well, that's highly individual based on the field station, all right? And so this is, I think, where desired learning outcomes and the assessment evaluation pieces that might fit here really has to take context into account and has to take those umbrella priorities into account. Jeff and I are working on a side project with Kellogg Biological Station in Michigan, and that's something they're really interested in. So we're working with their adult programs, and one of their big emphasis is we want people to be conservationists. We want people to change their behaviors. We want people to do something based on having been here. Well, what do you do if somebody only comes once and you never see them again? How do you, I mean, this is a problem with adult education as a field, right? If it's voluntary, in some sense, it's not up to us what happens next. There's a kind of turning it loose you have to do to say, yeah, we want something to come of this, and we have no control over it whatsoever. We have no carrots, we have no sticks. All we can do is put on a really great program that we think has value for people, and do our best to make sure that people who are going to be interested hear about it and that they get what they came to get. And anything else is icing, or we're really going to have to hustle hard to figure out what's going on. And so I think that's a great point in terms of what kind of resources our field station is going to need based on this project. How do we, I have more questions than answers. How do we design and build resources for, they call it K through gray, right? For the whole world's worth of STEM content knowledge, for any kind of approach that you can think to incorporate into engaging in participants, right? That's a big question, and we've got our work cut out for us to get to that. And that's kind of where I was going to land this to wrap up. Is more questions than answers, huge variety of things happening, and I think our job right now is just to get our heads around that variety, so we can take some useful steps forward to help this community of field station educational professionals, and to really make a difference in the way that that people understand science, right? We've got a huge issue, I think I'm talking to a friendly audience, a huge issue with science skepticism and climate change denial, and opportunities to engage with field stations at these places of unique environmental or scientific interest is a way to maybe get at some of those challenges we're having around engagement in the U.S. with science in general. What other questions do you guys have?
What I'm thinking about is Love's argument about nature deficit disorder. Field stations was pushing back against assessment, K-12 stuff, goals, etc. Just being out there may be a big enough value without a lot of superstructure of assessment and goals, etc. So what field stations do of getting people out in nature without prescribed outcomes and heavy assessment may be critical, may be essential.
Yeah, there's a lot of, I think this community is acutely aware of that, and definitely a lot of activity around getting kids there. Stuff that happens in the school year's got to be school-based, right? But the summer science camps are really about enthusiasm and interest and science identity and those kinds of things.
I think though we just need to rethink that word assessment. You know, I think a lot of us go to this place when we hear that word. I mean, the outcomes of going out to one of these biological centers is going to be up
highly
to the individual or
yeah.
the group. But we can't prescribe what that's going to be. I mean, it might be a phenomenon that somebody runs into and is now interested in and is going to dive into that phenomenon. I think as educators, we all fall into this trap that at the end we want them to sort of like list out the 4 main points that they got out of this. And that's when we want to do something authentic, the assessment has to be authentic too. And listing out the 4 takeaways is a really inauthentic way to think about learning.
And stuff that may be more authentic, like, do you ever come back? Is not particularly compelling when you're talking to a funding agency, right? There's a tension there for sure. Yeah.
So I guess I would ask, how do we get their gates to open more often? That's my question. I remember when I was in high school, I had a really persuasive geologist professor who had us go to a field station just randomly. He'd assign students, and they'd have to actually do water quality. And they'd test the water quality, and we would do that. And he just randomly assigned people to do it throughout the year, and everybody got a chance through the whole year. And it just reminds me, I think, with Lowe's paper, I think that we need to think about getting these kids to fall in love with science and nature first before we tell them to cure the ills of nature and that kind of thing. So, I mean, I think we need to get them accessing and being out in nature and using it before they have to, solve some problems that are going to be facing it in the future. So.
Yes, I absolutely agree with you. And this is my adult education, I don't want to neglect adults. We can't wait for kids to age into conservation and sustainability. This is our job right now. Yeah, we want to get kids ready to take over those responsibilities, but we can't wait for them to be ready for it, right? This also needs to be reminding adults that nature is fun, right? Put on your mosquito spray, let's get out there. I think that's a piece we don't talk about enough. I think my opinion of a lot of like Love's work and a lot of the conversations in environmental education is that adults are hard, right? They're set in their ways, they're grouchy, they're busy. We can't work with that. Let's focus on the kids. And I think that is exactly the opposite of the way that I want to think about it. We're the ones who can do things right now. We're the ones who have money and resources and transportation. Yes, exactly. We need to get adults out. We need to get adults thinking about this again. Yeah, Barry?
Along those lines, and when you say K to grade, of the respondents you have so far, Are there any older adults
So
programs?
the surveys are all the respondents or programs targeting older
Yeah,
adults?
so the programs you've had described so far in your responses. I noticed your age was
Yeah.
18 and over.
Yeah.
Do you have any like 50 and over?
Yeah, we don't have granularity in that regard. That's the kind of detail that comes out in the specific program description, that this is for seniors, right? Or this is for, so for example, Kellogg in Michigan gets a lot of scientists retired from the university who are then very active at the field station just because it's fun and they have time. So that is happening, but that's a level of detail from the data I can't speak to right this minute.
Are you going to parse it out in the data?
Eventually. Eventually. Yeah.
There's one program that I have seen so far that is specifically for older people or lifelong learners, as they call them, in California. So it is happening. I don't know how much of it yet, but that's just it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Jean?
There was a workshop here just a couple of weeks ago called Grain Green.
Yeah, I saw the announcement for that. I didn't get to make it.
Fascinating because you just want to do these activities, but at the end, I sent you an email already about that. We can talk more about it, but at the end, the people at the workshop, and they weren't just gray, they were all different ages, but committed to make certain, do certain things based upon this game. Actually, it was just I thought it might be a game that you might like to
share with folks. Yeah. Thanks, Jean. Other questions? Yeah.
So you talked a little bit, or kind of mentioned tensions in NSF grants.
Yes.
With outcomes and things like that. And we have a lot of doctoral students in the room. Can you talk through a little bit of the process of the NSF grant process, or just the large grant process, and kind of those tensions that you felt?
Yes.
Try to be political with that.
Yeah, so I'm trying to think, there's a lot of stuff. I'm trying to think where I want to start. So, like ground zero, like finding, so the first step is matching your ID to a request for proposals. And I think it's easy to think you can hammer a square peg in a round hole, and that just is a waste of everyone's time. So I think the first step is it's got to be a really clear and obvious fit, right? This isn't a thing that you can finesse. Earlier this year, I sat on a review panel where we read other people's proposals for the line I'm funded through right now. And hearing that conversation, nothing gets through. Nothing gets through. So if you're not a good fit, you're more or less dead in the water to begin with.
Are you in the informal ed line? What line of NSF are you?
Advancing Informal STEM Learning, ASL.
Okay.
And then the next part of that is the projects have some clear components, right? And the two big pieces are intellectual merit and broader impacts. So intellectual merit is like the quality of your idea, right? And what you propose to do. Like, do you have a good idea? Does it fit with this request for proposals? Do other scientists in your discipline think that what you plan to do makes sense? And then the broader impacts is, what's the point of this, right? Maybe you have a great research plan. What are you going to do with it? What's the compelling argument here for your scientific discipline, for society, for people who might end up participating in this program, those kinds of things. And so for education, I feel like it's easier to make the broader impacts case because we're already dealing with people, we're already helping people learn something, get better at something. For people in the natural sciences and engineering, typically that broader impacts is a dissemination plan of some kind for your research and a way that your project is going to have outreach. And outreach in the sense of what we're talking about with field stations, or outreach in the sense that you distill your science and take it to schools, or I've been sitting in on the Provost's NSF career seminar series to help people get career proposals together. And the thing they're talking a lot about is building kits, right? That you take your science and you turn it into a kit, and then you can take those kits to schools and students do experiments that are kind of little versions of your own work. So it's that broader impacts, that educational component for the natural scientists that ends up translating into, we're gonna bring some school kids to the field station. We're gonna hold a monthly lecture series. We're going to unlock the gates and take people on nature walks. That it's a way for scientists to disseminate their work and meet the requirements of NSF funding. Were there other parts of the grant process that I should talk about? Okay.
Were you the lead on this?
It's a collaborative proposal between CSU and Texas A&M. And the way that that works is we submit one narrative, so we describe the project together, and then we each submit our own budgets, and we each get our own money. So I'm the boss of my money, and they're the boss of their money, but we're working on a project that we designed and implement together.
So how did you get this idea?
I was actually brought in as the education expert. Of the two other PIs, Rhonda is a field station director, and Michelle is a evolutionary biologist, and she calls herself a field station groupie. So a field station director and a natural scientist had an idea that this was a problem, and they needed someone with education expertise. So it's really a great triangle of skills and abilities to work on all the various facets of this. Yeah, Ann?
So in some of the grants that I've been involved with that have had sub-awards, there's been an entity that acts as the main.
Yes, and this is different from that.
Right.
Yeah.
So it looks like both of you have, neither one of you have a sub-award with any.
Correct.
So that NSF sets that up? Or?
Yeah.
Okay.
They have a mechanism, and it's called a collaborative proposal.
Got it.
So 2 separate award numbers, a check to CSU and a check to Texas A&M. I am a PI, like the PI of my part, and Rhonda is the PI of the Texas A&M part.
But it's still considered one grant?
It has 2 award numbers.
Okay.
So we submit one proposal with all the documentation from 2 institutions, and you get 2 award numbers. Yeah. And that has the advantage of getting to be a PI on your CV. It has the advantage of your institution getting all the overhead rather than me having to submit my expenses to Texas A&M or vice versa. You can do it as a sub-award.
But if you have the choice.
But if you don't have to, don't do it. Yeah.
So one thing I heard a lot is that for something like an NSF grant, expect to apply multiple times before they even give you any serious look, especially if you're a new researcher, younger, newer researcher. Is this your experience? Is this a myth?
Yeah, I don't know. I feel very fortunate that this is the first time we submitted this proposal, and none of us had NSF funding prior. I think it speaks a lot to the leadership of my colleague, Rhonda, who has, she's the driver. And I think that was what was really key to the success of this proposal, is we started working on it in June, and it was due in November, and we had weekly meetings and monthly writing retreats, and we looked at every section of this proposal 15 times, and we had half a dozen other people read it. And that happened because Rhonda drove it. I can't give her enough credit. And when I read other proposals, I can see how the polish we had as a result of that hugely labor-intensive process, which did not seem worth it in the moment, made a difference in comparison to a lot of the things that got submitted, I think maybe last minute or on the fly or not entirely thought out. And that was the thing I noticed too, sitting on the review panel, that the review process almost seemed like you needed to make yourself bulletproof. That it wasn't about who had the best or most exciting idea, it was about who had the tightest, most critique-proof submission. And that in some ways makes sense, and that in some ways I think is sad. Because the things we ended up funding, one of them was submitted by not a university, but a corporation that does a lot of science activity. And it was clear that they'd had professional grant writers and thrown tons of resources at it. But the one that was most exciting was a single non-tenure track faculty teaching giant freshman classes who was hustling to do something different for her students. And there's no way she was going to get funded because that proposal was kind of a mess. And it was so exciting to read her enthusiasm. And so you just feel like that if she had had that team of grant writers, that would have been a no-brainer. And instead, we agreed to fund this massive, sort of robotic thing because it was so solid. It was entirely passionless, but it was so solid. And I think that's a tricky part too, is not losing your enthusiasm or your passion or the real meaning behind something when you're trying to submit something that is polished and bulletproof. So that was a long answer to your question, but.
I think it's great insight though, because it's about audience.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the NSF audience might be different than a foundational audience.
Yeah.
That's looking maybe a little bit for more passion and kind of innovation and things like that. So.
Yeah. The other thing that surprised me was the attention they paid to some of the supporting documents, like data management plans. That was a real criticism point for some reviewers, was that a data management plan wasn't robust enough or didn't entirely match the methodology in the research plan. So those things, I feel like I learned a lot from that. Other questions?
Good luck.
Yeah, don't screw it up.
Were there any biological stations that are in urban areas?
There's one in Memphis.
Okay.
Cedar Point is just outside of Akron, and I think they're close enough that they count as urban. Jeff, do you remember any off the top of your head?
Yeah, one in particular, there is a field station in Detroit that is actually at a water treatment plant, and it's run by, the field station itself is run by chemists and pharmacologists, which was kind of an interesting one for.
Pepperwood Preserve is just outside of the San Francisco Bay Area, which I think it's growing around them.
Right.
So I'm not sure if it counts as urban, but it's as good as, I would say. And those urban ones, to the best of my knowledge, typically do make a real effort to bus in kids from some of the school districts that may not get as much science opportunity. Great. Well, thank you all for coming. I appreciate your time.